In the spring of 1940, Europe found itself in the throes of transformation. The rapid fall of France to German forces in June left Britain as the sole major Western power, standing against the Third Reich. With the continent largely subdued under Axis control, the geopolitical landscape tilted dramatically. Adolf Hitler, having orchestrated a series of swift and decisive victories across Western Europe, now turned his attention across the English Channel. The British Isles, isolated yet defiant, stood as both a strategic barrier and symbolic target. The United Kingdom, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill's recently assumed leadership, faced grave uncertainty. Though the Royal Navy remained dominant at sea, the prospect of an aerial and amphibious invasion loomed. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's code name for a planned invasion of Britain, would hinge on the Luftwaffe's ability to establish air superiority over the Royal Air Force, RAF. Without dominance in the skies, any attempt to land troops on British soil risked catastrophic failure. Thus, air power became the decisive factor in Hitler's vision for subduing Britain. The strategic motivations for both sides were clear. Germany aimed to neutralize Britain before the United States could be drawn into the conflict. A successful invasion would not only knock Britain out of the war, but would also secure Germany's western flank, enabling further expansion into Eastern Europe. For Britain, survival was paramount. Losing air superiority could mean the fall of London and the end of organized resistance in Western Europe. Thus, the skies above southern England would become the arena for one of the most consequential confrontations of the Second World War. The Royal Air Force entered the conflict numerically inferior to the Luftwaffe, but with a series of advantages that would prove vital. British radar installations, part of the pioneering Chain Home system, allowed early detection of incoming raids. This technological edge, coupled with the strategic flexibility of fighter command, under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, provided a framework for rapid response to German incursions. On the ground, British morale was bolstered by a fierce national spirit and widespread support for the war effort, despite the recent trauma of Dunkirk. Germany, for its part, fielded a vast aerial armada. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, had proven its effectiveness in the campaigns over Poland, the Low Countries, and France. Its arsenal included the feared Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters and the versatile Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. However, the Luftwaffe was primarily trained and equipped for tactical support, not sustained strategic bombing. As the campaign over Britain intensified, this doctrinal limitation would become increasingly apparent. Meanwhile, both countries waged extensive propaganda campaigns to frame the upcoming battle. British broadcasts emphasized courage, endurance, and unity, while German radio and newsreels painted the RAF as crippled and demoralized. Leaflets, rumors, and misinformation were tools used to weaken civilian morale or sow confusion. Intelligence gathering also intensified. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park began to intercept and analyze encrypted German communications, providing vital insights into Luftwaffe intent. As the summer of 1940 approached, the stage was set. On one side, the Luftwaffe prepared for a devastating aerial offensive to dismantle Britain's defenses. On the other, the RAF readied its squadrons for what would become the first major military campaign fought entirely in the air. The fate of Britain, and arguably the course of the Second World War, would soon be decided not by armies clashing on land, but by the deadly ballet of fighters and bombers above English fields and cities. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe initiated its opening moves in what would become known as the Battle of Britain. The initial phase, referred to as the Kanalkampf, or Channel Battle, targeted British shipping in the English Channel. German aircraft, including dive bombers and fighter escorts, harassed convoys and ports in an attempt to lure the RAF into combat over the open sea, where downed pilots would be lost and aircraft irretrievable. These skirmishes tested British defenses and gauged fighter command's strength and readiness, setting the tempo for the aerial campaign to come. The early operations revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities. The RAF, operating from bases in southern England, scrambled squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes to intercept German raids. While Spitfires were generally superior in speed and agility to their German counterparts, Hurricanes made up the bulk of the British fighter force and were responsible for the majority of enemy kills during this stage. The use of radar, combined with Dowding's integrated command and control system, enabled efficient coordination of defense. However, pilots were strained by the frequency of missions, and losses began to mount on both sides. By early August, the Germans escalated their efforts. The Luftwaffe shifted from maritime targets to inland radar stations and airfields, initiating what British historians later identified as the main phase of the battle. German high command believed the destruction of fighter command's infrastructure would render Britain vulnerable to invasion. Thus, radar masts, operations centers, and sector airfields in southern England came under intense bombardment. Though some installations suffered damage, British repair crews worked rapidly to keep the network functioning, and the radar system was never decisively crippled. German intelligence underestimated the resiliency of the British system. Many Luftwaffe commanders believed the RAF was on the verge of collapse, misled by limited reconnaissance and optimistic reports from returning pilots. Goering, overconfident in his force's success, expanded operations to include broader targets. British airfields at Kenley, Biggin Hill, and Tangmere endured repeated attacks. While the strain on fighter command was growing severe, morale remained intact, bolstered by the knowledge that every day of resistance delayed a potential invasion. Throughout this period, both sides suffered heavy attrition. German bomber formations faced increasing resistance from RAF interceptors and increasingly accurate anti-aircraft fire. British pilots, many of whom flew multiple sorties per day, endured mental and physical exhaustion. The pressure on ground crews was relentless. Damaged aircraft needed to be repaired swiftly, and logistics channels had to function flawlessly to keep squadrons operational. Despite these challenges, British defenses held, and by mid-August, the conflict had become a war of endurance. The human dimension of the battle became starkly evident. Young pilots, many barely out of training, found themselves in daily life or death combat. Losses were personal, and the skies of southern England became a graveyard for dozens of aviators each week. The public began to take note. While early engagements occurred largely away from population centers, the rumble of bombers and the spectacle of dogfights in broad daylight brought the war to the civilian eye. Watching from rooftops and fields, Britons observed the unfolding struggle, aware that their nation's fate hung in the balance. German tactics evolved. In addition to bombers, the Luftwaffe began employing fighter sweeps to draw RAF planes into combat. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s operated near the limits of their range, offering brief air superiority before needing to return to France. This limitation increasingly hampered German efforts, especially as operations moved further inland. Meanwhile, British fighters could refuel and rearm quickly, returning to the fray in waves. By late August, the Luftwaffe intensified its pressure. The goal remained unchanged: destroy the RAF and secure the skies for Operation Sea Lion. The attacks became more focused, the tempo more unrelenting. Every hour of flight tested the mettle of both machine and man. In this crucible, the RAF proved not only its capability, but its determination to resist. The opening phase had begun as a test, but it evolved into a declaration. Britain would not yield its skies without a fight. As August waned and September approached, the battle entered a new phase shaped by refined strategic goals and intensified planning on both sides. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by the resilience of British air defenses and the continued survival of fighter command, reassessed its objectives. The earlier attempt to dismantle Britain's air defense infrastructure had not delivered the decisive blow Hitler and Goering anticipated. Consequently, the focus shifted toward crippling the RAF through sheer attrition, destroying aircraft and pilots faster than Britain could replace them, while simultaneously escalating psychological pressure through bombing campaigns aimed at urban centers. German command believed that Britain's will to resist could be broken if enough suffering was inflicted. This assumption rested on a mixture of flawed intelligence, misjudged cultural analysis, and an overestimation of the Luftwaffe's ability to sustain losses. Goering's insistence on centralized control, coupled with his obsession with prestige targets, began to influence operational decisions in counterproductive ways. Although Luftflotte 2 and Luftflotte 3 were capable forces, differences in their operational zones and poor coordination often diluted the overall effectiveness of the air campaign. On the British side, the strategic framework developed by Air Chief Marshal Dowding and his assistant, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, began to prove its value under stress. Fighter command was divided into regional groups, each with defined responsibilities, and coordinated through a central control system that relied on radar input, ground observers, and efficient radio communication. No other air force at the time had such a comprehensive air defense system. The structure allowed squadrons to be deployed with precision, avoiding unnecessary losses and maximizing the impact of every sortie. The British also benefited from domestic production and strategic stockpiling. Aircraft manufacturing had accelerated under the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and despite material shortages and bomb damage, factories in cities like Coventry, Birmingham, and Bristol continued to turn out Hurricanes and Spitfires at impressive rates. The pilot shortage remained critical, but efforts were made to recruit and train volunteers from across the Commonwealth and occupied Europe. Pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, and New Zealand joined the fight, bringing valuable experience and often unmatched ferocity. Logistics played a silent but crucial role. The supply of aviation fuel, spare parts, and munitions had to be managed with precision. The British were also innovating in subtle ways. For instance, their use of octane 100 aviation fuel gave Spitfires and Hurricanes a slight edge in climb and speed, especially when intercepting at high altitudes. The integration of ground defenses, including barrage balloons and anti-aircraft batteries, added further layers of resistance, complicating German operations. Propaganda on both sides intensified. In Germany, broadcasts declared the imminent destruction of British resistance, framing each raid as a decisive strike. In Britain, the narrative emphasized resilience, with Churchill's speeches serving as a rhetorical anchor for the nation's resolve. His words, delivered through radio and print, transcended political divisions and became a unifying force. Phrases like, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," transformed RAF pilots into symbols of national defiance. Despite these efforts, miscalculations and operational tensions mounted. The Luftwaffe's lack of a coherent long-term bombing doctrine led to conflicting objectives. Some commanders pressed for continued attacks on airfields and infrastructure, while others argued for targeting industrial centers or civilian populations. Göring ultimately chose to shift toward a more generalized bombing strategy, one that would soon evolve into the Blitz, but this lack of focus hindered the Luftwaffe's ability to achieve air superiority. Intelligence also played a growing role. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were gaining access to fragments of Luftwaffe communications, although the full potential of this intelligence breakthrough had not yet been realized. Nonetheless, it contributed to a broader understanding of German intent and aided fighter command in preparing for large-scale raids. British photographic reconnaissance aircraft, flying perilous missions over occupied Europe, returned with vital imagery that helped refine tactical decisions. Morale remained a complex but pivotal element. On the ground, the British population endured blackouts, air raid drills, and mounting anxiety. Yet, the sight of RAF fighters patrolling the skies inspired confidence. The pilots, exhausted and often mourning fallen comrades, carried on with a mixture of professionalism and sheer determination. For the Germans, the longer the battle dragged on, the more difficult it became to maintain the illusion of imminent victory. Aircraft losses grew, experienced crews were depleted, and the limitations of operating at long range began to weigh heavily. By early September, both sides had refined their strategic calculus. Britain sought to preserve its defensive capacity at all costs, avoiding overextension and focusing on efficiency. Germany, increasingly frustrated, prepared to launch a new phase of the campaign, one aimed not only at airfields but at the heart of British cities. The clash of doctrines, machines, and human endurance had entered a critical stage, and the decisions made in the coming weeks would not only determine the outcome of the battle, but would also shape the broader trajectory of the war in Europe. On September 7, 1940, the nature of the conflict transformed. That afternoon, nearly 350 German bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, crossed the English Channel and launched a massive attack on London. The shift in German tactics, from targeting RAF airfields and radar infrastructure to the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, marked a dramatic turning point in the campaign. The capital burned for hours, warehouses and factories in the East End were set ablaze, and civilian casualties rose sharply. Thus began the Blitz, an 8-month bombing campaign that would redefine both the Battle of Britain and the civilian experience of modern war. The decision to bomb London was influenced by a series of factors. Strategically, the Luftwaffe had failed to break fighter command through its sustained assaults on airfields. British defenses, though battered, had adapted. Intelligence failures and poor reconnaissance led German command to believe the RAF was on its last legs. Yet the reality was more complex. The RAF had been strained to the limit, but not broken. Meanwhile, a retaliatory RAF bombing raid on Berlin in late August had enraged Hitler, challenging the regime's image of invulnerability. In response, Hitler ordered the bombing of London and other major cities as a show of force and vengeance. The first major raid on London achieved both shock and destruction. Fires raged across docks and industrial zones. The civilian population, previously spared from the brunt of the war, now found itself at the epicenter. That night, as the fires still burned, another wave of bombers returned. The psychological impact was immense. Yet, instead of breaking morale, the bombing seemed to harden British resolve. Citizens took shelter in underground stations, adapted to the rhythms of nightly sirens and explosions, and began to embody the spirit of what would later be called the Blitz spirit. While the Luftwaffe believed that terror bombing would demoralize the British population and pressure the government into negotiations, the opposite occurred. The British media, under government direction, emphasized unity and courage. The Ministry of Information coordinated messaging through newsreels, newspapers, and radio broadcasts. Photographs of ruined homes, accompanied by stories of survival and heroism, were circulated widely. The King and Queen visited bomb sites. Churchill made frequent appearances and continued to deliver rousing speeches that reframed suffering as a badge of honor. Militarily, the shift in German strategy proved advantageous to the RAF. With the Luftwaffe now focused on cities rather than airfields, fighter command gained valuable breathing space. Dowding and Park used this respite to repair damaged bases, rotate exhausted pilots, and rebuild squadrons. Although London became a nightly target, the core of Britain's defensive system regained stability. The fighter pilots now fought closer to their own bases, which meant faster turnaround times and more consistent aerial coverage. German aircraft, on the other hand, continued to face the limitations of fuel range, especially for the escorting Messerschmitts. The engagements over London were ferocious. The Luftwaffe attempted to overwhelm British defenses with sheer volume, launching wave after wave of bombers supported by fighter screens. RAF squadrons scrambled repeatedly, climbing to intercept incoming formations. The speed and agility of the Supermarine Spitfire gave British pilots an edge in dogfights, particularly at high altitude, while the Hawker Hurricane remained effective at breaking up bomber formations. Anti-aircraft guns, though often inaccurate, added a layer of danger for German bombers and contributed to the growing attrition. September 15th became a defining moment. On that day, the Luftwaffe launched its largest daylight attack on London, expecting to crush the last remnants of fighter command. Instead, the RAF mounted a ferocious defense. Nearly 1,500 aircraft were engaged in the skies above southern England. The battle lasted hours, with formations breaking, reforming, and clashing in chaotic waves. The Luftwaffe lost more aircraft than on any previous day of the campaign. The failure to dominate the skies signaled to British leadership and to Hitler himself that air superiority had not been achieved. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was indefinitely postponed. Even as the Blitz intensified, the RAF held firm. Night raids became the norm. The Luftwaffe, unable to maintain air superiority during daylight, turned to nighttime bombing. This change in tactics posed new challenges. RAF fighter interception at night was still rudimentary, and radar-controlled anti-aircraft fire was in its infancy. bombs rained down on industrial centers like Liverpool, Birmingham, and Manchester. Coventry, in November, suffered a devastating raid that flattened much of the city center. Yet, factories continued to operate, transportation networks adapted, and the British government refused to entertain surrender. Civilian life adapted to the new rhythm. Blackout regulations were strictly enforced, and thousands slept in underground stations or Anderson shelters each night. Mobile kitchens, fire brigades, and medical volunteers became part of the nightly routine. Children were evacuated from urban centers to the countryside. Despite the hardships, shortages, destruction, trauma the population endured, this adaptation became a form of resistance, frustrating German hopes that terror would force Britain to capitulate. The Blitz also exposed the Luftwaffe's operational limitations. German bombers lacked the payload capacity and accuracy to destroy Britain's industrial capacity decisively. The Ju-88 and Heinkel He-111, while reliable, were medium bombers, incapable of the sustained heavy bombardment the campaign demanded. The lack of a dedicated long-range strategic bomber in the German arsenal would prove to be a critical failing in the months ahead. By the end of September 1940, it had become evident that Britain would not fall easily. The German air offensive, though terrifying and destructive, had failed to achieve its strategic aims. The opening battles in the sky had evolved into a prolonged war of endurance between civilian resilience and aerial bombardment. With fighter command recovering and German losses mounting, the Luftwaffe faced a sobering reality. The skies above Britain could not be conquered by force alone. As autumn deepened, the Battle of Britain transitioned into a prolonged phase of escalation, marked by nightly raids, increasingly destructive bombardments, and mounting casualties. What began as a campaign for air superiority had transformed into a grim struggle of attrition and terror. September's failure to dominate the skies during daylight forced the Luftwaffe to rely heavily on night bombings, initiating what became the most intense civilian-targeted air campaign in modern history. The Blitz, as it unfolded across the final months of 1940 and into 1941, tested not only Britain's military defenses, but also the limits of its social fabric and logistical resilience. From a military standpoint, Germany's revised approach centered on the sustained psychological and infrastructural degradation of Britain through relentless aerial bombardment. High command believed that by targeting ports, rail hubs, industrial centers, and densely populated neighborhoods, they could paralyze Britain's war production, disrupt internal movement, and demoralize the civilian population. London remained the primary target, but soon the raids extended to other major cities: Liverpool, Glasgow, Sheffield, Bristol, Plymouth, and Southampton, each critical to the nation's supply chains and industrial. One of the key operational challenges for the Luftwaffe was the increasing fatigue of its air crews. Many German pilots and gunners were flying multiple sorties each week, often through hostile weather, and under the constant threat of anti-aircraft fire. Unlike their British counterparts, who rotated through domestic bases and received rest when possible, Luftwaffe crews operated far from home and under enormous logistical strain. Aircraft maintenance suffered, navigation errors became more frequent during night raids, and morale began to erode as the British failed to break. The British, meanwhile, faced their own form of crisis. In cities repeatedly targeted by the bombings, emergency services were stretched to the breaking point. Firefighters, medical personnel, and civil defense volunteers worked long hours amid collapsing buildings and smoldering ruins. The challenge of extinguishing fires, rescuing the trapped, and providing aid to the wounded became a nightly ordeal. In London, entire blocks vanished overnight. In Coventry, centuries-old cathedrals were reduced to rubble, and yet the essential services of these cities kept functioning. Trains continued to run, post was delivered, and factories resumed work by daylight. Despite the devastation, British High Command refused to divert fighter squadrons to night defense in large numbers. The RAF lacked the technology for effective nocturnal interceptions, and daylight air superiority remained the strategic priority. Early night fighter missions using modified Blenheims and radar-equipped bow fighters achieved limited success. Ground-based radar had difficulty distinguishing between friendly and enemy aircraft at night, and visual spotting was all but impossible. Anti-aircraft fire was relied upon heavily, yet it was often inaccurate. Still, every Luftwaffe plane brought down, no matter how rare, was a blow to German confidence. In response to the intensifying crisis, British leadership invested in defensive infrastructure and civilian preparedness. The blackout was strictly enforced, shelters were expanded, and neighborhood air raid precaution (ARP) wardens played vital roles in saving lives and enforcing safety protocols. A system of rest centers was established for those who had lost their homes, and food rationing was tightened but remained manageable. Children's evacuation to rural areas increased, though many families chose to keep their children close despite the risks. Psychological fatigue was undeniable, but widespread surrender or defeatism did not take root. The winter months brought additional complications. Fog, snow, and extended darkness affected both attacker and defender. For the Luftwaffe, poor weather led to a rise in accidents and mission cancellations. For the British, colder nights meant additional hardship for those sheltering underground or in unheated bunkers. Disease began to spread among displaced populations. Yet, through this adversity, civilian morale exhibited a surprising stability. The concept of the home front evolved into a national cause. Resilience became an act of war. While British civilian casualties rose into the tens of thousands, strategic targets often remained functional. The Luftwaffe lacked the capacity for precision bombing, and widespread dispersal of British industry reduced the impact of even the most destructive raids. Railways, factories, shipyards, and munitions plants either survived direct hits or recovered rapidly through coordinated repairs. Workers returned daily to bombed-out facilities, and production figures in many sectors continued to rise despite the attacks. The growing scale of German losses also altered internal dynamics within the Luftwaffe. Senior officers began to question the sustainability of the campaign. Aircraft production in Germany struggled to keep pace with attrition. The British, by contrast, were increasing their fighter output month by month. Aircraft such as the Spitfire Mk2 and upgraded Hurricanes began to appear in squadrons, while radar technology continued to evolve, improving both early warning and tracking. Internationally, the Blitz drew attention and sympathy. American journalists reported extensively from London, and images of bombed hospitals and destroyed homes were broadcast across the Atlantic. President Roosevelt, while still bound by neutrality laws, used these events to strengthen public support for aiding Britain. The Lend-Lease Act, introduced in early 1941, would become a critical turning point in sustaining British resistance. By the end of 1940, the Luftwaffe had flown more than 13,000 sorties over Britain. Tens of thousands of buildings had been damaged or destroyed, and over 15,000 civilians had been killed. Yet the British government remained unbowed, the population largely united, and fighter command intact. Goering's promise to Hitler that he would destroy the RAF and subdue Britain from the air had proven hollow. The escalation in bombing had brought horror and destruction, but not surrender. In this crucible of fire and ruin, Britain hardened into a nation capable of long-term resistance. The Blitz had not broken the country, it had galvanized it. And for the Luftwaffe, what had begun as an assertion of dominance was quickly devolving into a costly, unsustainable campaign, one that offered diminishing returns, growing losses, and no clear path to victory. By early 1941, the Blitz reached its most intense and destructive phase. While the Luftwaffe had failed to eliminate the Royal Air Force or prepare the ground for an invasion, Hitler's regime continued to pressure Britain from the air, shifting the war's focus towards psychological warfare and economic disruption. Cities were bombed with increasing frequency and intensity. London endured more than 50 consecutive nights of raids between September and November 1940, and the campaign now expanded to Britain's industrial heartlands. This period, the peak of the Blitz, tested not only the capacity of the British government and its armed forces, but also the very endurance of its people. In February and March 1941, the Luftwaffe intensified attacks on key ports and manufacturing centers. Cities like Plymouth, Swansea, Belfast, Hull, Portsmouth, and especially Liverpool were struck repeatedly. As Britain's most important Atlantic port, Liverpool became a primary target due to its role in receiving supplies and war materiel from North America. Night after night, warehouses, shipyards, and civilian districts were set ablaze. Yet the port never ceased operation. Convoys still arrived, unloading tanks, planes, and fuel under the cover of smoke and rubble. Cranes were rebuilt, rails were repaired, and docks continued to function under the most hazardous conditions. Civilian suffering increased in proportion to the scale of these attacks. Thousands were killed or wounded. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. Hospitals, churches, and schools were not spared. In Coventry, the bombing on the night of November 14, 1940, destroyed over 4,000 homes and nearly wiped out the medieval city center. The firestorm created by high explosives and incendiaries overwhelmed the fire services, and the city burned into the morning. Coventry's cathedral, a historic symbol, was reduced to ruins. Yet even this devastation failed to halt production. Factories resumed operation within days, and many workers returned to the ruins to continue manufacturing aircraft and munitions. At the same time, political leadership played a vital role in managing the crisis. Churchill's cabinet, despite internal disagreements and moments of despair, maintained a consistent message. The war would be fought and won at any cost. The Prime Minister himself visited bombed cities, often against security advice, standing in the rubble with survivors and relief workers. These visits were not merely symbolic. They reinforced trust between the government and the public. In a time of growing hardship, the visibility of leadership served as a psychological bulwark against despair. The operational peak of the Blitz also brought changes in Luftwaffe tactics. Increasingly, bombers used Pathfinder aircraft to drop incendiaries that marked targets for following waves. This method allowed for more concentrated attacks. Moreover, improvements in German navigation, such as the use of radio beam systems like Nikkebein, enhanced bombing accuracy during nighttime raids. British countermeasures, however, evolved in response. Electronic warfare units began jamming the beams, and new techniques like window, aluminum foil strips dropped from aircraft to confuse radar, were being developed. RAF Bomber Command, though still relatively limited in capability, began striking back more frequently. Raids on German industrial cities like Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin continued, though they had minimal material effect at this stage. Nonetheless, the symbolic impact was significant. No city, including the Nazi capital, was entirely safe. This reciprocal bombing began a tit-for-tat escalation that would define the strategic air war in the years to come. Meanwhile, British intelligence services, particularly those operating from Bletchley Park, continued their quiet but critical work deciphering German communications, allowing better anticipation of attack patterns. Back in Britain, the cumulative effects of months of nightly bombings began to show. Mental health issues, especially among children and the elderly, became increasingly visible. Many suffered from sleep deprivation, chronic anxiety, and trauma-induced symptoms. Yet the government maintained a tight grip on the narrative. Films, radio programs, and posters continued to emphasize resilience. Newsreels rarely showed the worst devastation. Instead, they highlighted stories of survival, community solidarity, and defiance. Business as usual became a mantra repeated in shops, newspapers, and factories alike. Innovation became essential. In addition to improved radar systems and early warning methods, Britain invested in civil defense technology. New types of shelters, like the communal Morrison shelter, were distributed. Portable fire pumps, mobile repair units, and underground medical facilities were expanded. The rapid creation of temporary housing helped accommodate those rendered homeless. Local councils, under immense pressure, coordinated emergency food distribution and water supplies, ensuring no part of the population was entirely abandoned. At sea, the Royal Navy and Merchant Marine faced parallel challenges. The German Navy's U-boat campaign aimed to strangle Britain's lifeline by attacking shipping routes. The Blitz on port cities was intended to complement this by disrupting unloading and storage. But despite some success, neither strategy proved decisive. British convoy systems, bolstered by Canadian and American escorts, adapted effectively. Naval communication, radar-equipped escort ships, and increasingly aggressive anti-submarine tactics began to turn the tide. By May 1941, the Luftwaffe launched one of its final major raids on London, delivering massive damage and killing over 1,400 people. Yet this attack would be one of the last of its kind. Within days, Hitler's attention turned eastward. The planned invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, demanded a massive redeployment of Luftwaffe units. Germany's focus shifted, and the bombing of Britain rapidly declined in intensity. The peak of the Blitz thus closed not with a decisive victory or collapse, but with a gradual transition. The Luftwaffe had failed to bring Britain to its knees. Instead, it had hardened the nation's resolve and forced rapid innovation across military and civilian spheres. Despite the horrors endured, over 4,000 civilian deaths, hundreds of thousands injured, and entire cities scarred, the United Kingdom remained defiant and operational. The battle for the skies had reached its zenith, and Britain had endured. The next phase of the war would be fought elsewhere, but its outcome had been shaped by what had transpired over London, Liverpool, Coventry, and countless other cities in fire and darkness. As the immediate threat of invasion receded and the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign waned in intensity, Britain entered a critical phase of adaptation. The country, still under threat and reeling from months of nightly raids, began to transform its defensive posture into something more sustainable and strategically flexible. The focus shifted toward building long-term resilience, ensuring military readiness for future offensives, and addressing the deep physical and psychological toll of the Blitz. Even as the bombs continued to fall, though less frequently, the British population and state institutions evolved into a war machine capable of surviving prolonged total conflict. The most striking example of this transformation was the increasing effectiveness of Britain's defensive architecture. Radar, which had already proven crucial in detecting incoming raids, underwent continuous refinement. The introduction of ground-controlled interception, GCI, allowed night fighter squadrons to be vectored with greater precision toward enemy bombers. The Bristol Beaufighter, equipped with airborne interception radar, became a valuable asset during nocturnal missions, finally giving the RAF a reliable method for combating the Luftwaffe at night. Though interception rates remained modest compared to daytime operations, each successful engagement boosted morale and reduced the sense of helplessness that had defined earlier months. At the community level, adaptation was equally pragmatic. Shelter life evolved from a temporary refuge into a system of nightly ritual. In London, thousands continued to sleep in the underground, where conditions were far from ideal. Yet, through grassroots organization and municipal intervention, these makeshift shelters became more habitable. Electric lighting was installed, sanitation improved, and entertainment, such as musical performances and readings, was introduced to maintain morale. Some neighborhoods established informal shelter societies to organize food, childcare, and basic health services during extended raids. On the industrial front, adaptation was even more dramatic. Factories were dispersed, camouflage techniques improved, and entire production lines were relocated to less vulnerable areas. In Birmingham and the Midlands, underground manufacturing facilities were developed or expanded. These efforts ensured continuity in the production of aircraft, tanks, guns, and ammunition. Women, increasingly vital to the workforce, took on roles previously restricted to men, accelerating the reshaping of Britain's wartime economy. The necessity of survival overrode traditional social structures, and the state now facilitated this transformation through training programs, child care services, and transport systems. Innovation was not confined to technology and logistics. Tactically, the RAF revised its doctrine for air defense. The concept of big wing formations, where multiple squadrons were grouped together for large-scale interception, had been controversial early in the battle, but was re-examined as British numerical strength grew. Although the tactic remained debated, it became clear that flexibility, rather than rigid planning, would dominate future responses to aerial threats. Fighter Command began to experiment with layered defenses, rapid squadron rotations, and coordination with searchlight and gun batteries to increase effectiveness under limited visibility. Adaptation also took place at the highest levels of British governance. The War Cabinet reorganized key ministries to streamline wartime administration. The Ministry of Home Security, for instance, played a central role in coordinating civil defense, while the Ministry of Information refined its propaganda efforts. Posters, radio shows, and short films emphasized vigilance, sacrifice, and community. The Blitz was now framed as a shared national experience, one that united all classes and regions in a common struggle. This message, carefully constructed and reinforced, helped to suppress dissent and maintain cohesion even in bomb-shattered communities. Public behavior, too, evolved. The initial panic and confusion that followed the first raids gave way to routine. Air raid sirens were no longer met with fear, but with practiced response. Families prepared emergency kits, organized rapid exits, and adhered to blackout rules with near-religious consistency. Schools operated on split schedules or moved to basements and cellars. Markets functioned under canvas tents in bombed-out districts. Religious services, weddings, and funerals continued amid the ruins. Even as war disfigured the physical landscape, it failed to shatter the rhythm of daily life. In military terms, the RAF and broader British forces used this phase to consolidate, retrain, and expand. Pilots who had fought through the worst months of 1940 now became instructors. Training schools increased their output. Aircraft technology advanced steadily. New variants of the Spitfire and Hurricane entered service, incorporating lessons learned in combat. Bomber Command expanded its role, planning deeper penetrations into German territory. Coastal Command refined anti-submarine tactics, vital to securing Atlantic supply lines. Equally important was the refinement of Britain's intelligence apparatus. The work at Bletchley Park deepened, with further breakthroughs in deciphering the Enigma code. These advances allowed the RAF to anticipate raid patterns, assess Luftwaffe strengths and weaknesses, and track strategic shifts. Combined with increased photographic reconnaissance and signal monitoring, Britain now had a clearer picture of the evolving enemy than at any previous point in the war. The psychological landscape also shifted. Where once fear and uncertainty dominated, now a steely pragmatism set in. The shared trauma of the Blitz had not broken the nation. It had recalibrated its expectations. Loss was normalized, and endurance became a form of cultural capital. Stories of survival, stoicism, and solidarity circulated as oral history and legend. This period birthed the mythos of the Blitz spirit, an idea partially cultivated by propaganda, but undeniably grounded in real acts of courage and self-sacrifice. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe struggled with its own adaptation. The demands of Operation Barbarossa drew aircraft and personnel away from the Western Front, leaving fewer resources to sustain the bombing of Britain. German air crews became increasingly aware that the campaign had failed in its objectives. Losses were high, replacements lacked experience, and British defenses were growing stronger by the week. Hitler's interest had moved eastward, and with it, the strategic focus of the war. Thus, in early 1941, Britain stood transformed, no longer merely defending against annihilation. It was now shaping its long-term strategy for survival and retaliation. The adaptation of its people, institutions, and military structures laid the foundation for eventual counteroffensives. What had begun as a desperate defense was evolving into preparation for a wider war, a war in which Britain would no longer fight alone, and in which the lessons of the Blitz would resonate far beyond its island shores. The true turning point in the Battle of Britain and the Blitz did not arrive with a single battle or a decisive weapon, but with the slow, grinding shift in momentum that unfolded across the early months of 1941. This shift was driven by both British endurance and German overreach. While the Luftwaffe had entered the campaign with confidence and numerical superiority, by the spring of 1941 it found itself strategically overextended, tactically constrained, and increasingly unable to adapt to the evolving nature of the air war. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority over Britain became irreversible. What remained was a recognition, even among some German commanders, that the campaign had not only failed, but had become counterproductive. The gradual withdrawal of Luftwaffe units in preparation for Operation Barbarossa marked a critical strategic reorientation for Germany. The Eastern Front demanded a vast number of aircraft, pilots, and logistical support. Hitler's attention shifted to the Soviet Union, and with it, the Luftwaffe's main thrust of operations. Bombers and fighters were redeployed from France and the Low Countries to airfields in Poland and East Prussia. This withdrawal reduced the scale and frequency of raids on Britain. The pressure that had once been constant now came sporadically, and with it came opportunities for Britain to recover, rearm, and refocus. This decision to pivot away from Britain was not made in a vacuum. It was the product of cumulative failures. First, the Luftwaffe had underestimated the strength and adaptability of the Royal Air Force. The assumption that fighter command could be overwhelmed in a matter of weeks proved deeply flawed. Second, the limitations of German aircraft and bombing doctrine became glaringly apparent. The Luftwaffe lacked heavy bombers capable of sustained, high-altitude attacks over long distances. Its operational planning remained rooted in tactical support and battlefield interdiction, not strategic bombardment. This was evident in the inefficiency of the Blitz itself. Despite months of bombing, British industry had not collapsed, civilian morale had not broken, and military production continued to grow. Third, German intelligence repeatedly failed to assess British capacity accurately. Luftwaffe reconnaissance missions were limited in scope, often flying too high to gather useful detail, and post-mission reports were subject to optimistic distortion. Intercepted communications and signals intelligence were poorly exploited. The consequence was a gross underestimation of British recovery capabilities. German command believed the RAF to be on the verge of collapse, even as new squadrons were being formed and aircraft production increased. On the British side, the turning point was not merely one of reprieve. It became a moment of strategic clarity. By the summer of 1941, Britain could confidently assert that it had survived the Luftwaffe's worst. Fighter command emerged bloodied but intact, with a new generation of pilots and aircraft ready to take the offensive. Aircraft such as the Spitfire Mk and new variants of the Hurricane now formed the core of British aerial strength. Radar coverage had expanded, night interception capabilities improved, and the training pipeline had begun to deliver a steady stream of pilots, both domestic and foreign. Equally transformative was the growth of Britain's global alliances. In March 1941, the United States passed the Lend-Lease Act, which provided Britain with vital supplies of food, fuel, vehicles, and military equipment. Though the U.S. remained officially neutral, this act of economic warfare against Germany signaled a geopolitical shift. Britain was no longer alone. The flow of goods across the Atlantic, protected by increasingly coordinated naval convoys, ensured that the British war machine would not run dry. The Luftwaffe's failure to sever this lifeline, despite intense efforts to bomb ports and destroy merchant shipping, further underscored the limits of its campaign. Domestically, the narrative of survival had hardened into a national ethos. The Blitz spirit became not only a matter of morale, but of identity. It permeated art, literature, radio, and cinema. Government messaging emphasized not only defiance, but continuity. Children's schooling resumed, rationing was normalized, and housing repairs were systematized. The civilian population, once at risk of collapse under the weight of constant aerial bombardment, had instead become a crucial pillar of the war effort. This period also saw the strengthening of British counterintelligence operations. The double-cross system, which turned German spies into double agents, began to bear fruit. False intelligence was fed back to the Abwehr, further confusing German assessments of British vulnerability. Meanwhile, Bletchley Park's codebreakers were providing insights into German plans with increasing accuracy. This informational superiority began to shape British strategy in profound ways, allowing the RAF to better anticipate raids and deploy assets accordingly. As the Luftwaffe's presence diminished, the RAF took cautious steps toward the offensive. Fighter sweeps over occupied France, dubbed rhubarbs and circuses, became more common. Though limited in scale, these missions demonstrated a shift in posture. Britain was no longer merely defending its skies, it was probing the enemy's defenses. Bomber Command also increased its activity, shifting from symbolic raids to more systematic targeting of German infrastructure. Though its impact in 1941 remained limited, these raids laid the groundwork for the strategic bombing campaign that would define the air war in the years to come. The implications of the turning point were not lost on foreign observers. Neutral nations, watching from afar, saw in Britain's survival a sign that Nazi Germany was not invincible. The global narrative began to shift. What had been framed as a probable German triumph now appeared as a stalled offensive. American policymakers, journalists, and citizens were increasingly persuaded that aiding Britain was not a lost cause, but a strategic necessity. This shift in perception would prove critical in the months ahead, as Germany's war expanded and America edged closer to direct involvement. For Germany, the failure to defeat Britain by air marked the first major strategic setback of the war. It revealed the limitations of blitzkrieg when applied beyond land-based theaters and exposed systemic flaws in doctrine, leadership, and coordination. The Luftwaffe entered the Eastern Front in June 1941 without having secured its western flank. The consequences of that decision would echo throughout the rest of the war. Thus, the turning point of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz was not a moment of thunderous climax, but a gradual, undeniable transformation of the strategic landscape. Britain had not only resisted, it had evolved. And from the ashes of bombed cities, it emerged with its institutions intact, its will hardened, and its future no longer held hostage by the specter of German air power. As the Luftwaffe's raids dwindled in frequency and intensity throughout the summer of 1941, Britain entered a phase of post-crisis consolidation marked by assessment, recovery, and strategic recalibration. The immediate danger of invasion had passed. Fighter command was no longer under daily siege. The worst of the Blitz had been endured, and yet the aftermath of the battle presented a new set of challenges that extended beyond the visible wreckage of cities into the less tangible realms of trauma, displacement, and social fragmentation. The physical toll on the country was immense. Over 2 million homes had been damaged or destroyed. In cities like London, Liverpool, Coventry, and Birmingham, entire neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by fields of rubble and scorched masonry. Infrastructure essential to urban life, gas lines, water mains, electric grids, had been repeatedly disrupted. Transport routes had been severed and then restored under duress. The effort to clean up and rebuild began even before the bombs had ceased falling. Emergency demolition teams worked alongside volunteer brigades and military engineers to clear debris, stabilize buildings, and restore basic services. Yet reconstruction was not solely a technical endeavor. It was also deeply political. The war had exposed long-standing inequalities in British society. Working-class districts, often located near factories and docks, had suffered disproportionately. These communities not only faced higher casualties, but also slower recovery. Public pressure began to mount on local councils and the central government to prioritize fair housing allocation, rebuild with modern infrastructure, and plan for a post-war Britain that would not return to the structural inequities of the past. The psychological consequences of the Blitz also required attention. For many civilians, especially children and the elderly, the experience of nightly bombings had left deep emotional scars. Mental health support was rudimentary by modern standards, but there was growing recognition of trauma's effects. Reports of bomb shock, nervous breakdowns, and persistent anxiety increased. In response, the government expanded counseling services through voluntary organizations and local health authorities. While no formal psychiatric campaign existed, efforts were made to reintegrate evacuees, re-establish family units, and promote stability through social programs. Among the displaced, return was often impossible. Tens of thousands had lost everything. Temporary shelters and rest centers were transformed into long-term housing solutions. Prefabricated buildings began to appear on the outskirts of bombed cities. Churches, community halls, and schools became administrative hubs for managing the needs of the dislocated. In rural areas that had received evacuees, complex dynamics emerged between host communities and urban families. Though most returned to the cities after the raids subsided, a portion remained, reshaping local demographics and contributing to Britain's rural economy. The labor force, already under strain before the Blitz, faced renewed pressure. Skilled workers were in high demand for both civilian reconstruction and military production. The state introduced new employment schemes, encouraging women to enter the workforce in greater numbers. Propaganda emphasized the patriotism of war work, and social norms continued to shift as women took on roles in construction, manufacturing, logistics, and administration. These shifts, born of necessity, would have lasting effects on gender roles and labor policy in the post-war period. Politically, the aftermath of the Blitz reinforced public trust in the wartime coalition government. Churchill's leadership had weathered the storm, and despite internal criticisms, particularly over the initial state of air defenses and civil preparedness, his personal involvement in relief efforts maintained his popularity. The Ministry of Information carefully managed his image, portraying him as tireless and empathetic. Meanwhile, labor ministers within the coalition gained credibility by focusing on social welfare, urban planning, and equitable recovery. This balance of wartime unity and domestic reform laid the groundwork for the post-war welfare state. The RAF's internal assessment of the campaign was similarly introspective. Fighter Command undertook detailed reviews of tactics, equipment, pilot training, and logistics. Lessons from the battle directly informed the development of new aircraft, like the Hawker Typhoon, and improved Spitfire models. Training programs were expanded and refined. The creation of specialized night fighter units, equipped with increasingly sophisticated radar and interception tools, was prioritized. Ground crews, whose role had been vital but under-recognized, received better support, training, and recognition for their contributions. Equally transformative was the evolution of civil defense doctrine. Authorities reviewed shelter effectiveness, warning systems, and firefighting strategies. New policies were drafted for future emergencies, including improved building codes, more efficient evacuation protocols, and decentralized civil defense networks. The wartime experience prompted a reimagining of how the state could and should protect its citizens, not only from bombs, but from deprivation, displacement, and neglect. Internationally, the aftermath of the Blitz enhanced Britain's moral authority. Having endured a direct assault by Nazi Germany, the British narrative of resistance gained significant traction abroad. American journalists, diplomats, and politicians increasingly cited Britain's stand during the Blitz as evidence of the nation's resolve and deserving of support. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the memory of the Blitz played a role in shaping transatlantic cooperation. It became a shared symbol of what the Allies were fighting to preserve and what they stood against. However, not all consequences of the Blitz were uplifting. The strain on families, communities, and institutions left invisible fractures. Crime rose in some areas, particularly looting and black market activity. Domestic violence, alcoholism, and abandonment spiked, though these were often hidden beneath the surface of official reports. Class tensions simmered as wealthier districts recovered more quickly than poorer ones. Some critics accused the government of using the Blitz as a rhetorical tool to gloss over these inequalities. Religious institutions saw fluctuating engagement. While some churches experienced revivals during the worst of the bombings, offering comfort, ritual, and community, others struggled with declining attendance in the aftermath. The war had not only changed the city skyline, but also the interior landscapes of belief, identity, and belonging. In the armed forces, the psychological impact of the Blitz was also felt. Pilots and anti-aircraft crews carried the burden of knowing that every missed bomber might mean hundreds of civilian deaths. Some suffered from what would now be recognized as combat stress, yet many emerged with a hardened sense of mission. For these servicemen and women, the battle had not been abstract. It had been fought over their own homes, their own families, their own streets. That intimacy with war forged a determination that would guide them in the campaigns still to come. By the close of 1941, the immediate chaos of the Blitz had subsided, but its legacy remained etched into every level of British life. The battle for the skies had ended not with surrender, but with a reconfiguration of what it meant to endure, to fight back, and to rebuild. The RAF, the government, and the civilian population had survived a campaign unlike anything the modern world had seen, and in doing so, had redefined the very concept of national defense. In the aftermath of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, the war-torn island nation emerged not only intact, but irrevocably transformed. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival became one of the defining episodes of the Second World War, a moment when the fate of Europe hinged not on tanks or armies, but on the control of the skies and the endurance of civilians. For Britain, the outcome of this aerial campaign was more than a military victory. It was a validation of national will, a crucible in which modern Britain was reforged under fire, fear, and unyielding resistance. The long-term effects of the battle rippled outward across every layer of society. Militarily, it marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany and dispelled the myth of its invincibility. The Luftwaffe's inability to destroy the Royal Air Force or prepare the ground for invasion altered Hitler's entire strategic timetable. Operation Sea Lion was abandoned. German attention turned eastward, ultimately leading to the catastrophic decision to invade the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe, bled and strained, would never again hold uncontested dominance over European skies. In contrast, the RAF matured into a global force, laying the groundwork for Britain's expanding role in the Allied air campaign over continental Europe. Strategically, the Battle of Britain prevented a total Axis domination of Western Europe. Had Britain fallen, the geopolitical map of the war would have shifted dramatically. American support through Lend-Lease may never have materialized. The Soviet Union might have faced a two-front war with no Western distraction for Germany. The mere survival of Britain ensured a Western base for future offensives, including the D-Day landings 3 years later. The preservation of British territory meant the preservation of hope, a platform from which liberation could one day be launched. Domestically, the Blitz accelerated profound changes in British society. The shared hardship of bombings, evacuations, and rationing broke down long-standing class barriers, if not entirely, then meaningfully. The government's expanded role in civilian life, through welfare programs, civil defense, and public housing, laid the conceptual and administrative foundations for the post-war welfare state. Institutions born from wartime necessity would evolve into peacetime guarantees, the National Health Service, expanded public education, and comprehensive social security. In surviving total war, the British state reimagined itself not merely as a protector of borders, but as a guardian of peace. The emotional and cultural imprint of the Blitz became equally lasting. The few of fighter command were immortalized in public memory, honored not just as pilots, but as symbols of resistance. The imagery of searchlights in the night sky, sirens wailing over silent streets, and Londoners gathering in underground stations became etched into the national consciousness. Songs, films, and literature celebrated the spirit of defiance and endurance, often idealized, sometimes mythologized, but always grounded in collective memory. This identity, stoic, unified, resilient, would shape how Britain saw itself and how the world saw Britain for decades to come. Internationally, the successful defense of Britain served as both a military and moral turning point. It proved to onlookers that Hitler could be resisted. For the Americans, the British stand validated the argument for involvement. For the occupied peoples of Europe, it offered a rare and vital beacon of hope. And for the Germans, the failure to defeat a single nation, despite overwhelming power, raised questions about the limits of their expansion. British resistance became a cornerstone of Allied propaganda, a narrative of freedom against tyranny that would dominate wartime discourse. Yet the legacy of the battle is not without nuance. Beneath the proud headlines and defiant rhetoric lay untold grief. Over 4,000 civilians were killed. Tens of thousands more were injured, displaced, or traumatized. Cities were physically scarred in ways that would take decades to repair. The psychological costs, sleepless nights, lost families, shattered neighborhoods, left marks no bomb could measure. And while the Blitz spirit became a source of national pride, it also risked obscuring the complexities and inequalities of the experience. Not all communities were affected equally. Not all wounds healed at the same pace. Historians continue to debate aspects of the battle, the effectiveness of certain tactics, the role of propaganda, the accuracy of casualty reports, the extent of strategic impact. Yet these debates coexist with an enduring consensus. The Battle of Britain was a hinge moment, not merely in the war, but in the 20th century. It was a campaign fought in the air but felt on the ground, a conflict measured in dogfights and bombing tonnage, but ultimately decided by human tenacity. In surviving the Blitz, Britain had proven something elemental, not only to its enemies and allies, but to itself. That democratic society could withstand mechanized terror. That technology, no matter how destructive, could be met with organization, courage, and adaptation. And that even in the darkest hours, history could be shaped not only by generals and statesmen, but by citizens sheltering under fire, firefighters dragging hoses through rubble, pilots flying on fumes, and volunteers pulling survivors from ruins. The Battle of Britain and the Blitz did not end the war, but they ensured it would continue, and on terms not dictated by the Reich. In preserving its skies, Britain preserved its sovereignty, its future, and its role in the eventual defeat of fascism. That legacy remains one of the most powerful testaments to collective resistance in modern history.